Well, at £20 million, his garden's going to be like Kew Gardens, isn't it? I don't know about anything else on gardening leave. But I think, again, this comes down to the skill of and the perception of that director of football, that only over time you're going to see how good they are at their role. And I think the very best ones are very brave how they shape it. You know, they shape it around the history of the club. You know, we've been to clubs where there's a very different feel of how you should play. Some people, really weird people, might want to be head of performance or head of medical. Or
nobody wakes up wanting to be either head of performance or, to steal his phrase, Gary Neville.
Support services in terms of data and GPS were relatively limited.
Or not at all.
Or not at all. You know, but if you look at that, so, you know, you think of how big staff, you know, we laugh sometimes, don't we? We've been into clubs and we've gone, blimey, they've got more players, they've got more staff than we had players in other clubs.
Yes.
A Recaro seat is slightly bigger than the head coach's Recaro.
Recaro's throne. The Recaro throne coming to a dugout near you.
There you go. Welcome, football fans, to Breaking Lines, the podcast that takes you behind the scenes of the beautiful game like never before. I'm Gary Rowett, former player and manager, joined by the insightful Dave Carolan, a man with his finger on the pulse of football's beating heart. Together, Dave and I bring you unrivaled insight, context, and a few stories from the trenches. Join us as we dissect the game, break down the plays, and explore the intricate dance between managers, players, fans, and the beautiful game itself. This is Breaking Lines, where the game is more than just a match.
Well, Gary, there's a new sheriff in town, and he's rode in on his steed, and he's the sporting director or technical director. There's multiple names for this type of role. It's providing a whole new landscape in football, certainly here in the UK.
Yeah, it has. I think it's something that's come in relatively recently in the UK. I think, you know, you've got examples of people that have been in their roles for a while, but I think it's, you know, if you look at take the Premier League out of it for a second. If you look at the Championship and League One, I mean, there's only 2 or 3 clubs in each of those leagues that haven't now got a sporting director. Well, if you probably went back 6 or 7 years, I would imagine most of those clubs wouldn't have had a sporting director. And I think this is something I've spoke about quite a lot, actually, at different clubs and to different people. But if you look at the European model, and it's very, very prevalent in Europe, you know, if you look at the likes of Monchi, you know, Roma and Seville, that quite a well-known sporting director, Zorc at Dortmund, Begiristan at Man City. You know, this has happened at top clubs for a while, and you know, certainly the European model, a lot of the clubs, and the reason they have a sporting director is because a lot of these clubs have a way that they think that club probably should play, you know, a real ideal framework for that club. You know, and if you're a head coach, you're going into those clubs having an understanding of what, you know, let's say you're going into an Ajax or a Bayern Munich or whatever that is as a head coach, you should have an idea of how that club culturally want to play. And obviously you have ways around that you can change and you can shape as a head coach, but you have an understanding of that. And that's the director of football's role, essentially, to help shape that and have an overview of it and work with the main people in the club, one of which is the head coach, to create success and a sustained success, I think. So I think it's something that European clubs have done really well for a number of years. You know, you go back a long time and they've been doing it for a long time. I think a lot of the clubs in the UK have recently started to adopt that, you know, with different amounts of success. And I think it always comes down to the skill of that person and how that person shapes that role and in which way they do that. But it's definitely something that we're seeing a lot more. And I think it actually, if it's done really, really well, and there's some good examples of that, I think it can be a incredibly positive way forward. And, you know, I think it'll save clubs a lot of money. I think it could enhance their chances of success. And I think it probably creates a slightly different type of person that they bring in to run their football team, essentially.
So in the very recent past, we've seen a bounty put on the head of Dan Ashworth to try and extricate him from Newcastle United and attract him into Manchester United. He's now on gardening leave as we speak. Does that open up the potential for sporting directors who get results, who are of a high enough profile to potentially be the subject of transfers just like players? I mean, reportedly a £20 million transfer fee for a sporting director. Like, we would never have heard anything of that up until probably this year.
Well, at £20 million, his garden's going to be like Kew Gardens, isn't it? I don't know about anything else on gardening leave, but yeah, I think again, when you change the landscape of an industry, and let's say you add in the sporting director as a clear main role, to a certain degree. Look, I don't mean you're ever going to take away the importance of the manager, head coach position, but I think you certainly add in the importance of a sporting director role to a club and to an industry, and particularly a club that, just like someone like Man United, who perhaps haven't had the success and a lot of criticism of the way they've ran perhaps their transfer operations or their recruitment of managers or whatever that might be. The recruitment of players, like I spoke about, that maybe suddenly that role becomes more and more important. Just like if a team's not winning games, you have to get the right manager, you have to get the right head coach in. But I think in someone like Dan Ashworth's case, I think he's shown how good he is at his job and how important someone like that can be. So why wouldn't you pay the same money in compensation as maybe a manager? Or why wouldn't you pay? Look, of course, you're never going to pay the same sort of transfer fees, if you like, as a player, because the director was never quite going to have that extrinsic value on them, are they? You're never going to get a director of football that's maybe worth 100 million, but you're going to get, like a player would be, but you're going to get a value on a person that can maybe shape an industry and lead a club like perhaps Man United for the next 20 years. And you can't tell me that role isn't absolutely vital for that football club. So I think it's definitely, so again, something they've probably been doing in Europe for a long time and understanding the importance of that role. Something in the UK we're really starting to get our teeth into how much that person can help shape an organisation and can help. For me, it's a continuity builder. That's what they do, and they have a great opportunity to not just look at what's happening on the field. They have an opportunity to build some of those things off the field and that surround the head coach and the players and the team and the staff, and help give longevity and add incredible value behind the scenes that maybe people won't. For a football fan might look and say, £20 million for a guy, well, what a job that is. But actually, when you're involved in the game, I'm not saying you have to be involved in the game to understand it. When you're involved in the game, you can see the importance of someone to help build culture, someone to overview the data, someone to help align recruitment, someone to help align the first team in the academy. Someone to shape all of those things and keep them together. I think is there's an incredible value to that, isn't there?
I suppose you touch on a few points there that for most fans, they won't necessarily understand what the breadth and depth of the role of a sporting director is. They're not necessarily picking the team, are they? But they may be involved in a lot of things surrounding the support of the team and ensuring that it's best placed acutely to perform on a game-to-game basis. But as you mentioned, they have to also think strategically long-term across a number of different departments. What kind of things would come under the kind of remit outside of picking the team and deciding the strategy for a game?
Yeah, I think the role of a sporting director, if you had to sum it up as a bit of an overview, is help build a legacy for the club. I think that's the important bit. So whether that's a legacy of data, whether that's a legacy of information from a recruitment perspective, whether that's, so because it's not just about supporting and helping the head coach while he's there. It's about, what does a club look like in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time? How can we sort of build some of those bits that maybe, if you think about it, if you think about the Championship, for example, there's been a lot, look, and I've been part of that sort of merry-go-round of managers in some ways, but yeah, I can still see the pitfalls of that from a club's perspective. I think that if you're someone who has an opportunity to help define what the club's playing style might look like around their environment and their fan base and the geography and the culture and the history of the club, I think that's a positive thing, because actually as a head coach, it helps you go into a club and you know really what the expectation is straight away. I think most coaches have, you pick the right head coach for the right remit and the right role. I don't think that ever changes. But what I don't think you do is you don't let a head coach come in or a manager come in and change everything, and then you decide that the results are not good enough 3 months later, and you have to go and get another one who then changes it all again. And I know that's probably a very black and white way of describing it, but ultimately as a club, that's going to, any business wouldn't change their business model every 6 months. Every club wouldn't have a massive turnover of staff and a massive turnover financially every 6 months. So it makes sense to try to create a longer term vision. And often the head coach, it's hard for a manager or a head coach to have that, because of course you want to win games straight away. You're under pressure to win games straight away, and the staff are under pressure to deliver results straight away. So I think for someone to be able to shape that in the background, so what does the playing style maybe look like? But you allow the head coach to be a little bit flexible to win games. Of course, you have to. What does that staff look like, and how do we support the manager the best? So can we get the best performance staff in? Can we get the best medical? There you go. So yeah, I think we can. Can you still do the podcast?
Yes.
Yeah. So, but I think, if you can do that again, and it's not, look, there's a balance, isn't there? That member of staff has to work and help the manager as well as the sporting director. And there has to be that alignment, doesn't there? I think there has to be the alignment. It can't just be those staff work for the sporting director in the club and not for the head coach, because I don't think that works either. If there's a real alignment and actually you can help support the head coach with good staff and good people, and, document and shape that data over a long period of time, I think that can have a massive, massive impact in the ability for the head coach to really focus on the things that are important during the week. Also, stuff the club are doing that perhaps, as a manager, sometimes you're going in and, you're looking at the club have got ideas long term, you've got to try and help them with, I don't know, they're moving training ground, or they're helping develop their stadium, or whatever that might be. You're trying to help recruitment. You're trying to help that. So there's so many things that can sometimes be a deterrent sometimes they can be positive, sometimes they can be a deterrent for a manager to do your job to the best of your ability, because you're getting dragged in all sorts of different directions. So I think there's also a benefit of working in alignment with somebody else to actually take some of that away from you, so you can focus on the important parts of the week. So I think that's how I would describe the role of a sporting director, to shape and help create and mould the environment and the culture, and also help the club to build a legacy that's probably more sustainable than any manager could do when there's that quick turnaround, So how do you see that role as a director of football sort of developing, and where do you see the importance of that in the sort of UK landscape?
I think from speaking to colleagues, and from my own experiences, I think the best sporting directors are really good facilitators for the staff that they have in place, and allowing the departments to grow within their means as well. It's not like a smorgasbord of just get as much staff as you want, as much services and product, that technologies that you might want to use. They have to make good decisions around what's sustainable growth for each of those departments, and whatever the strategy is going to be that's put in place by the sporting director, technical director, that there is alignment around what's achievable, because we've seen it in the past, haven't we, with kind of academy mission statements and visions, that achieving what's being set out is practically impossible because you don't have the resources, either human resources, financial, or other resources. So I think working with them closely to know where we can get to and what's achievable within our means is really important. Notwithstanding that, you have to get results, and getting results at different times throughout the year can mean sometimes having to be really flexible on what that might look like in terms of, for example, accessing different nutritional products that might benefit us, accessing other technologies that might benefit us. As we mentioned in other episodes, you want to get in a cryo chamber because it's a dense period of games. They can help with that. And I think because they work closely with the board of directors or maybe the CEOs, they can facilitate that kind of access to budget that previously you just wouldn't have had in your own role because, you're kind of too far down the pecking order. But with a really good sporting director in place, they allow you to have those conversations a little bit easier because they already not necessarily hold the purse strings, but they have access to them. And I think that's where it's been really useful seeing how really good sporting directors have allowed the work that lots of different departments want to get on with can flourish. Because maybe back in the day where a manager would have to oversee all of his football budget, they could be protective of certain, pockets of cash because maybe they don't want to spend that. They need to save that for something else. And that maybe has allowed us in other departments to be able to be a little bit more creative and effective.
But no, you're right. I mean, I remember when I first started out in League Two at Burton, you would manage, you'd work closely with a chairman and owner to basically manage your own budget. This is your budget. This is how you can do it. So you might, let's say one season you need to advance. It might be that you have to bring more youth products into the team to not just facilitate that pathway and the pathway down further down the line to the other academy players as a very positive stance and position and situation, but actually to save money for the first team, so you can maybe spend a little bit more on the top end players to maybe give you that little extra little bit. And you're right in if you're at a bigger club with that budget and you're shaping what you want to do, of course a lot of managers are going to think about, how can I use that money? You want 50 grand to go and get some software that you think actually helps the club over 10 years. And I want that as part of the wages for a top player on loan that might make the difference in the next 3 months. Obviously, I'm going to prioritise, but actually that might not necessarily help the club long term. Yeah. And that's where I think it's a very positive thing that actually somebody that can work in very, very close, because I think that's the key, to work in close alignment and close proximity with a head coach, head of performance, head of medical, and create like you say, a way of supporting those people to get the best out of what they're doing, but maybe give them the chance to work effectively, time-wise, on the things that are the most important. So collating all the data for the club, managing the budget, these are the things that you don't really, what you're doing a lot of the hard yards with a recruitment team. These are the things really you don't really get the benefit from necessarily as a head coach until the last moment where those teams are playing, or or you've got the use of whatever it is you want. So I think it's great for them to be able to shape that and understand. I think the role also at the moment is very different in the UK. If you look at, for example, over in Germany, I was speaking to a sporting director recently, but they sit on the bench. So the expectation over there, and I would imagine in a lot of other European countries, the sporting director sits on the bench and is part of the team. I don't think necessarily making interventions.
You might struggle at some of the benches in the UK because there is enough seats already.
We can't even get the extra subs on, can we? But
we've got to sit on drinks boxes after week.
But they sit on the bench and they're actively part of the team and they're pretty visible from the outside. And it would be interesting how a lot of sporting directors would actually feel about that because, it is a very different landscape. They would do a lot of the media commitments or they would be open at all times to the media in Germany. So they're quite a front-facing point of the club and the team. And in some ways, I think rightly so as well. If you're going to be in a position of such importance and actually having that open dialogue and communication to the fans and the club, I think is also really important. And the flip side to that ultimately is if you're going to pay more money to try and get a Dan Ashworth, I'm using that, we're using that as an example, of course. That's not to put too much pressure on Dan. But, if you're going to pay that amount of money, of course, those positions are going to start to become more forward facing and people are going to expect us to have more communication lines with those people. And actually, in the end, those people are going to become under probably a little bit more pressure, like a head coach would. And that's just going to be a natural growth for that position when they become more important and more prominent within the country.
So go back to what you said there about budgets, and that is managing those kind of budgets and those early parts of recruitment. Is that one of the big things that they've taken on in that role, which has meant that the title as such of manager has shifted to head coach, because you're in that role more focused on just the coaching of the team, the preparation of the team, and the strategy around match days, as opposed to having to think too much about watching video all the time of potential players that you're going to be scouting, or having to deal with the contract situations of different kind of performance or medical or scouting staff.
Yeah, a little bit of both. I think that if you look at, for me, I'm trying to look from a sort of someone who's been a manager and a head coach, and I'm trying to look at the differences of why clubs would want to bring a sporting director in. And I think it's clear to me that one, that continuity element of being able to keep a lot of the support services similar for a club, being able to support the head coach in a different type of way. So taking away some of the importance that a manager would have of trying to build the culture. Look, I think the head coach manager is still going to always help shape the culture. You're still going to watch games of players that you want to sign. You're still going to have an eye on all of the data, but just maybe you won't have to spend quite so much time doing and managing all of those different departments. I think it can be a shared responsibility, but certainly can help. And I think one of the main reasons, and again, I go back to what I said earlier, that, if you're a business and you see some clubs are very good at continuity, aren't they? They'll keep a manager for 4 or 5 years. And a lot of times you see success with that, and you see the benefit of continuity at a club. Sometimes that's not always possible, is it? Because, managers will come in, and I've done it, where you come in and after 4 or 5 months, you think of our time at Stoke, for example, and just bluntly, after 4 or 5 months, the results weren't as bad as we perhaps would say, but they weren't as good as would needed. So it's very difficult for a club with a lot of pressure on them to succeed and go up, to have that continuity and give you that time. So I think clubs are trying to get away from change your manager every 3 or 4 months, change or a lot of the staff every 3 or 4 months, change the way that you play. Because if you're a manager that goes from a very attacking style to maybe a very defensive style, maybe a 4-2-3-1 to a 5-2-3, it's going to need a slightly different squad. And to keep churning that squad and keep changing the manager and keep churning the staff, quite bluntly, is going to cost an organisation, or it has cost organisations, an inordinate amount of money. So I think most clever owners and most business people aren't going to want that. They're not going to see success occurring as frequently if that's the model they follow. So I think it's obvious to me that a lot of clubs have seen that, they've realised that, and they've realised that actually shaping it a slightly different way with a director of football in a more prominent role is a better outcome for success. And that's what it's all about, isn't it? And of course, there's so many different aspects to that role, but I think that's the main reason for it. And that's the main overview for it. And I think that's a sensible thing. I remember going in at Derby as a manager, and this is not a criticism of the club at all, but at the time and I think the club kind of wanted to shape it in a certain way. And I think it was really, really good that they did that, but I think they needed more meat on the bones, in my opinion, where they had the Derby way was everywhere, wasn't it?
Block capitals.
Block capitals everywhere in the gym.
12 foot.
Yeah. But, as imagery and as a sort of collective kind of to try and get everyone thinking the same way and shaped the same way, and a unity from first team to academy, I think was a really powerful thing. I think what I always said was the same, was what is that? I've been in a team as a player that got out of the Championship into the Premier League and were winning lots of games at the top end of the Premier League. And I don't know what the Derby way looks like. There's people who've played in the 70s and 80s and 60s that were part of brilliant Derby teams that felt a different way. So, maybe to me, what does that look like? Let's shape that. Let's come up with a way that you think that is what Derby should do. This is how Derby should play. In front of 30,000 fans every week, there should be a little bit more to just that. And maybe there was behind the scenes.
Do you think, though, maybe there's also now a drive for, obviously, sporting directors have to almost set out what the identity is, the DNA, if you want to call it like that, of each club. But it seems like a lot of those are very similar. I remember when the academies were being instigated in the late 1990s, it was everybody had to have their vision of how they wanted to play it. It was largely similar across lots of clubs. They wanted to dominate possession. They wanted to be aggressive. They wanted to be athletic. They wanted to be attacking and exciting, all of those things. But not everybody can be that. So how does that give head coaches that opportunity to maybe have any variance in that? Or is every team now going to be expected to almost play the same way, coach the same way, which doesn't give you an awful lot of variety, does it?
Well, I think there's always going to be a danger in any position, whether that's the head coach or director of football, but you don't want to go into a club and shape it any other way than, because you want that to reflect how people see you. So you're going to try and shape it as attacking front foot football or a variant of that.
Yes.
And I think there's a pressure on a director of football now to go and shape how they see the game and straight away when they're talking to their club's media when they join a club. But I think, again, this comes down to the skill of and the perception of that director of football, that only over time you're going to see how good they are at their role. And I think the very best ones are very brave how they shape it. They shape it around the history of the club. We've been to clubs where there's a very different feel of how you should play for that club. So from Burton to Birmingham, this is my journey from Burton to Birmingham to Derby to Stoke to Millwall. Each club has a different feel to it. And each club you can feel maybe should play in a slightly different way. And I think and each club's got a very different budget, which I think is, part of what you're alluding to. Each club has a different capability around what they are. So if you have a low budget, you need to find little differences. You need to find little game changes that you can do differently versus your competitors who maybe have more money. And you've got to find those little niches. And I think that's something that the director of football has to find and has to shape their philosophy on. I don't think it's ever going to... I think a head coach always has to have the ability to be flexible and shape. But, I spoke to a club recently that was, look, we want to play this way. And this is how we've recruited. And this is how we feel we should play. And my question was, okay, so what flexibility have you got within that system? So let's say that system's a 4-2-3-1. If I feel like I need to shape that as a 4-3-3 at some point, or if I need to shape that as a 4-5-1, or whatever I need to shape, that could be anything you want, can't it? There's all very different attacking versions of that or defensive versions of that.
Yes.
And I think as long as within the game you can tweak and change and do what you need to do to get a result, I think that's important. But I also think it's important if you buy into a club's way of playing. So let's say, for example, if I buy into that and a club says to me, it's really important that we have our academy players as part of our team, and it's important that we have that culture as a club that we develop young players, or maybe the club needs to be a club that has a sustainable model, but they need to sell players every season. Look at someone like Brighton have done that brilliantly in the Premier League. They've competed with a style of play, possession-based brand of football, but have also given opportunities to young players because selling players at peak value, or being able to use that cycle of recruitment and recruit, give an opportunity, make mistakes, sell players as part of their model of sustainability is also important. So I think also as a head coach coming into a club, it's also important if that's the way the club wants to play, you then also got to support that head coach in maybe that young player making mistakes, and he's got to go with that player, and maybe that affects results for a game or two, but you have to long term give the backing and support to the head coach as well. So I think it goes hand in hand, and I think that again comes down to the skill of that person. I mean, I think what's interesting for me is the different routes now, because once it was either everyone look, I'm going to say everyone wants to be a coach or a manager. Of course they don't. Some people might want to be a head of...
Some people
really weird people.
Some people look higher in the game.
Some people, really weird people, might want to be head of performance or head of medical. Or
nobody wakes up wanting to be either a head of performance or, to steal his phrase, Gary Neville.
No, but there's loads of different avenues to get into football at elite level, isn't there? Or whatever level you want to get into. Yes. But I think a director of football is a new role predominantly for other people. So you've got a player finishing playing now and we've had good examples of that. George Fend recently at Bristol Rovers has gone from being a player, he's retired one day and become a director of football the next day. And there's going to be different challenges for him, but there is an opportunity now for a player to actually not want to be a coach or a manager and actually want to be a director of football, because maybe they want to get into some of the more commercial elements, or they want to actually be a bit more of a facilitator in terms of developing a club and helping
those routes into becoming a sporting director. I mean, it's still relatively immature in this country, as we've spoken about, far more developed. It was in the 80s, probably even before that in Europe, at places like Ajax, they were already thinking about this kind of long-term strategic development of the club and the players within the club and how they recruited. But in this country, certainly qualifications around being a sporting director or technical director have been around 10 years or so. And now the routes into those roles, we've seen everybody from, as you just mentioned, players who are still playing the game, who are studying for it. You're seeing people who have been in recruitment. You've these ex-managers and ex-players. I mean, there's fundamentally lots of different types of sporting director, and their bias is also going to affect maybe how they'll work with managers or coaches. Like, if they've spent time as a manager or as a coach, they're probably going to perceive the pressures of that role differently from somebody who's maybe worked in a different department, who've also done the qualifications and have the certificate, and now decide that they too want to take on the responsibility of those roles.
Yeah, and also you look at a role and you think, maybe if you're a player coming out of the game, regardless of what you're interested in, you maybe look and go, well, maybe there's more longevity in a role like that than perhaps there is if you're a head coach or a manager or working in a different role. So there's all sorts of different attractions to why you might want to go into that role. And like you say, there can be players, there can be head coaches and managers who want to go back into that role and use their experiences of what they think a head coach or a manager might need in terms of that support. So I think there's a benefit to that.
We've seen someone like Mark Bowen at Reading, who has been the sporting director, was a player and has managed as well in the time. So he's kind of experienced all kind of levels on that side to it, doesn't he?
Yeah, and I think that's equally sort of poignant and important in encapsulating what that role might need. I mean, they've had a very turbulent last 12 months. So that's not been an easy role in a difficult club, hasn't it? In difficult circumstances. You've also got, I suppose a natural way of getting into that role is being in recruitment and a head of recruitment, then going into being a director of football, because one of the big parts of being a director of football are, we've all seen how big the performance element in football clubs are, but also how big the recruitment arm is and how many staff are involved in that, and managing and shaping and collating all the information that and all the data and statistics that we've sort of spoke about in different episodes. That there's so much available now that actually, that's one of the reasons why I think a manager once wouldn't have had to deal with a lot of those things, but now a director of football, there's so many more things. One thing we haven't spoke about really is, and I'm digressing slightly, but maybe one of the reasons a director of football is now even more important at a club is because when we first started, staffs were very relatively small. support services in terms of data and GPS were relatively limited,
or not at all,
but if you look at that, so you think of how big staff. We laugh sometimes, don't we? We've been into clubs and we've gone, blimey, they've got more players, they've got more staff than we had players in other clubs.
Yes,
because staff have grown. You look at the data element of a football club has massively grown. Whereas maybe you were dealing with no companies, you're now dealing with 5 or 6 different companies and arms of different strands of data. Maybe, whereas once you had 5 or 6 staff, you've now got 25 or 26 staff. And so therefore it's impossible for one person to deal with that. And so that's a very important factor as to why, clubs now need a director of football to help support the head coach and all the heads of departments. And I think how that director of football gets into position, for me, doesn't really matter. I've seen good. It's a similar debate to what makes a good manager or head coach. Someone who's played the game at the top level, someone who hasn't played the game at the top level, someone who's not played the game at all. Whereas once we would have frowned on that, saying, "Well, how can they understand it?" Now I think there's so much information around that you could have never played the game, and you could never have been involved in football. Yet you could still you could come from business and be a brilliant director of football. You could come from outside of football, but have worked your way up and be a brilliant head coach. I don't think there's any one size fits all. I think the very best people in the role, the very best directors of football for me, create a great, well, not always, but they don't need to, but create a good relationship with all those staff that help make those members of staff feel like they're supporting them rather than telling them what to do and telling them how their role should look. Of course, there's probably a time for them to do that also. But I think there's a brilliant way of supporting the people at the club in their departments and taking the weight of them and pointing them in the right direction, I think. And I think that's a key facet to it.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there in terms of coordination of a vast number of staff. Like you only had to see the celebrations of Liverpool in the cup final and the amount of staff and the size of the squad. It's so many people that have to be looked after across a whole organisation that it's not conceivable really for someone like Jurgen Klopp or an equivalent head coach to manage all of those people and all of the individual things that are going on around that staff, people coming and going, recruiting new members of staff, whatever department it might be, facilitating families of the players and ensuring the player care is looked after. So it's such a huge organization now, especially at the top level, that I think it's only going to be in time where we see these roles in the lower levels of the game. I don't mean that disparagingly to any club or any league, but where we're seeing novice sporting directors now going into clubs, and they're going to have to learn on the job. It's almost like making their debut as a player. If you were a player, that you're going to probably make mistakes early on. It's whether the mistakes are catastrophic or not that you're going to build your career and get a chance to progress. Because I suppose, coming back full circle, if you want to be that Dan Ashworth that's £20 million in the sporting director transfer market, everybody's going to want to try and move forward, aren't they? And maybe that will become competitive, because in 10 years and multiple cohorts of sporting directors, we've now got more sporting directors than we have clubs. So there's going to be churn in that industry in time, isn't there?
Yeah, but that's what I said earlier. I think in terms of that pressure, I think that's going to be a role that's going to come under more scrutiny. And as important builds in a role, then the scrutiny builds. That's just the way it works, doesn't it? That's the hand in hand. You become, you go from being a coach or as assistant manager, and you're still doing a very important role, but you're not under the same pressure. You become a head coach or a manager. Suddenly all eyes are on you. And that's that. And part of you wants that, but part of you, maybe when you experience it, it's a very different experience. And I think the sporting director role is going to be the same. You because you're visible, because most of the times you're at a home game, you're gonna come under more scrutiny, aren't you? The more that there's a Dan Ashworth that gets poached by a club like Man United for a vast amount of money, the more those positions are going to be dissected by analysts, and they're going to be dissected by the fans in different ways. But I think it's a role that is incredibly important. I think it's a role that clubs need, and I believe that clubs in the UK have needed to follow the European model for a long time. I think common sense suggests that it makes no sense to change your business model every 3 months. It makes no sense to have that type of churn. I think a director of football can change that and alter that. And I think the skill now is going to be in, when you need to make a head coach change, it's bringing in the right head coach for the right way that your club wants to play and for the right parameters around what success looks like to your club. And I think that's going to be a very, very skilled selection choice from that director of football, whereas maybe once upon a time that was the owner that made that decision, and the owner became under pressure. Hey, maybe that's why they've done it. The owners are maybe the owners want less pressure on them. Who knows? But I think it's a critical role. I think we're seeing very good protagonists of those roles. I think we're listening to podcasts with some of those people. I've listened to some brilliant, not quite as brilliant as our podcast, of course,
obviously,
but some brilliant podcasts of sporting directors, in European clubs and clubs domestically. But it's a great insight into what they have to do. It's a great insight behind their understanding of the role and where they want to help shape the club. And I think it's only going to grow. Where every Dan Ashworth is, they're going to be a 50 million. When's the first? We're going to start seeing now, aren't they? When's going to be the first 50 million pound director of football, or the first 100 million? But it shows how important this is.
Well, I think we'll just keep our eye out for when those new Recaro seats get installed in the dugouts, ready to sit beside the manager. That's when we know that the sporting director has fully probably established itself here in England.
A Recaro seat is slightly bigger than the head coach's Recaro
throne. The Recaro throne coming to a dugout near you.
There you go.